There was a house in the American countryside that seemed to have been forgotten by time. It stood at the end of an old dirt road, beyond a wide field, and beneath several enormous trees that had been growing there for generations. For many years, nobody lived inside. The windows were dark. The front door remained closed. The wooden porch slowly aged beneath the changing seasons. Grass grew along the pathway, leaves gathered against the steps. And the old road that once carried horses, wagons, neighbors, and children gradually became quieter. But if you had stood in front of that same house more than a century earlier, you would have seen something completely different. You might have seen smoke rising gently from the chimney. You might have heard the sound of a horse moving inside the barn. Perhaps a child would have been running across the yard. Someone might have been carrying a basket from the garden toward the kitchen. And from inside the house, there may have been the quiet sounds of breakfast being prepared. The house was never meant to be abandoned. It was built as a home, and like many homes across 19th century America, its story began not with anything extraordinary, but with ordinary people trying to build a peaceful life. The farmhouse stood in a rural part of the United States, surrounded by fields and woodland. There were no tall buildings nearby, no paved highways, no electric poles crossing the landscape. No cars passing along the road. The countryside was open and spacious. A person could stand on the front porch in the evening and look toward the horizon without seeing much more than trees, fields, and perhaps the smoke from a distant chimney. The house itself was modest. Its walls were made from wooden boards. The roof was built to withstand rain and winter snow. The front porch was narrow but useful. It provided a place to sit during warm evenings and a little protection from the weather. Behind the house stood a barn. Nearby was a small chicken coop. There was also a vegetable garden, carefully maintained through the warmer months. A well provided water. A wood pile stood close enough to the kitchen that someone could bring in firewood without walking too far through the snow. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. The people who lived there understood that survival depended on preparation. Winter could be long. A storm could make roads difficult. A failed harvest could create serious problems. So the family worked throughout the year to prepare for whatever the next season might bring. Their day began early. Often, the first person awake would be the one responsible for starting the fire. The house could be cold before sunrise, especially during winter. A few pieces of dry wood were placed carefully into the fireplace or stove. A small flame appeared. Then another. Slowly, warmth spread through the room. Outside, the countryside remained dark. Inside, the family began another day. Water had to be brought from the well. Animals had to be fed. Eggs had to be collected. Breakfast had to be prepared. There were no modern appliances to make these tasks quick. Every ordinary activity required time. But because people lived this way every day, they became skilled at it. A person knew exactly how much wood to use. They knew how to preserve food. They knew how to repair a fence. They knew how to care for a horse. They knew which crops grew best in the local soil. This knowledge was passed from one generation to another. Children learned by watching adults. They did not need formal lessons for every part of life. Much of their education happened through daily work. A young boy might learn how to handle a horse from his father. A young girl might learn how to preserve vegetables from her mother. But the responsibilities were not always divided so simply. Everyone helped. Everyone had something to do. And the house was at the center of it all. The kitchen was probably the busiest room. Food had to be prepared from ingredients that were either grown nearby, raised by the family, or purchased from a local store. Bread might be baked at home. Vegetables could come from the garden. Eggs came from the chickens. Milk might come from a nearby cow. Meat could be preserved for later use. The kitchen, therefore, served as more than a place to cook. It was a place where family life happened. People talked there. Children listened to adults. Stories were told. Plans were made. During winter evenings, the kitchen might also become the warmest room in the house. The family gathered close to the fire. Someone might read a newspaper. Someone might repair clothing. Someone might carve a small piece of wood. Children might listen to stories until they became sleepy. There was no television, no radio, no glowing screen. The darkness outside was real, and because there were fewer distractions, ordinary conversations could last much longer. The house itself was quiet, but it was not lonely. It was filled with the sounds of family life, footsteps, doors opening, wood being placed into the fire, dishes being set on the table, clock ticking somewhere in the room, wind moving against the windows. These small sounds were part of everyday life. Outside, the seasons continued. Spring was a time of renewal. The snow disappeared. The ground became soft. Farmers prepared their fields. Seeds were planted. The garden was cleaned. Animals became more active. Trees developed fresh, green leaves. The countryside slowly changed from winter gray to spring green. For the family in the farmhouse, spring meant work. Long hours were spent preparing the land. There was always uncertainty. Would there be enough rain? Would the crops grow? Would insects damage the plants? Would a late frost destroy the young crops? Farmers could plan carefully, but they could never control the weather. That uncertainty was simply part of rural life. Summer brought longer days. The sun rose early and stayed visible late into the evening. The fields became green and full. The family spent more time outdoors. Children could play near the creek or beneath the trees. But summer was also one of the busiest seasons. Crops needed attention. Hay had to be gathered. Animals needed care. Fences needed repair. The work could be exhausting. Still, there were peaceful moments. At the end of a long day, the family might sit on the front porch. The sun would slowly disappear. The sky would turn gold, then orange, then darker blue. Birds would become quieter. The temperature would begin to fall. Someone might pour a glass of water. Someone else might simply lean back and listen. In the distance, perhaps a horse moved through the grass. The countryside became still. These moments were ordinary, and perhaps that is why they were so easily forgotten. History often remembers presidents, wars, inventions, and great cities. But most people in 19th century America lived ordinary lives. They worked. They raised children. They built houses. They planted gardens. They attended church. They visited neighbors. They became old. And they died. Their stories rarely appeared in history books. Yet their lives created the America that later generations inherited. The family living in this farmhouse was one of those families. They were not famous. They did not expect anyone to remember them. They simply wanted a safe home, enough food, healthy children, and a future. The house represented that hope. Its walls protected the family from winter storms. Its porch provided a place for summer evenings. Its kitchen brought people together. Its barn protected animals. Its garden provided food. Every part of the property was connected to their daily lives. As the years passed, the house became more familiar. Children, who had once been small, grew taller. A young boy, who had once followed his father around the barn, eventually learned to work alone. A little girl who had once played in the garden eventually became responsible for part of the household. The family changed slowly. That was the nature of life. One generation followed another, and the house remained. It watched the seasons pass. It watched children become adults. It watched horses come and go. It watched wagons travel down the road. It watched storms cross the fields. It watched the first snow of winter fall onto the porch. The house could not remember in the way a person remembers, but the marks of those years remained. A worn section of floor near the kitchen. A smooth wooden stair rail touched by thousands of hands. A doorway where generations of children had been measured for height. Small scratch in the wall. A nail holding an old family photograph. These details may seem insignificant, but together they tell a story. The story of people who lived there. As the 19th century continued, America began to change. Railroads spread across the country. Towns grew. Factories became larger. New technologies appeared. Travel became easier. Markets expanded. Young people began hearing about opportunities in distant places. The world beyond the farmhouse slowly became more accessible. At first, these changes seemed far away. The family could still farm. They could still travel by horse and wagon. They could still buy supplies from a nearby store. They could still walk to church. But the world was beginning to move faster. Eventually, one of the children would have to decide what kind of life they wanted. Would they stay on the farm? Or would they leave? Would they continue the family's way of life? Or would they seek something new? For the moment, there was no answer. The farmhouse remained full of life. The fire still burned. The garden still grew. The animals still waited in the barn. And every evening, when the sun disappeared beyond the fields, the family returned home. The front door closed. The lamps were lit. The world outside became dark. And inside that simple wooden house, another ordinary American night began. Nobody knew that one day the house would become empty. Nobody knew that the road would become quiet. Nobody knew that the garden would disappear beneath the grass. Nobody knew that the children who laughed inside those walls would eventually become names in old records. For the family, there was only the present. Another morning would come. Another day of work. Another season. Another year. And for many years, that was enough. The farmhouse stood quietly beneath the trees, holding the warmth and memories of one American family. It had been built to last. And for a long time, it did. But eventually, the family would begin to change. And when they did, The house would slowly begin its journey from a living home to a forgotten place. The story of that change would not happen in one dramatic moment. It would happen quietly, one departure at a time, one empty room at a time, one closed door at a time. And that is where the next part of the story begins. The farmhouse had stood quietly for many years, watching one season follow another. Inside those wooden walls, generations had grown up. Children had learned to walk across its floors. Parents had watched them grow. Grandparents had sat beside the fireplace during winter evenings. And through all those years, the house had remained a familiar place. But no home stays exactly the same forever. People grow older. Children become adults. Families change. And sometimes, without realizing it, people begin to move away from the places where they were raised. For the family who lived in this farmhouse, the changes began slowly. There was no single day when everything became different. Instead, it happened through ordinary moments. A son began thinking about finding work somewhere else. A daughter began imagining a life beyond the farm. A young couple started considering a home of their own. The world outside the farmhouse was becoming larger, and America was changing with it. Railroads were connecting communities. Small towns were growing. Cities were becoming centers of opportunity. Factories needed workers. Businesses were expanding. For a young person living on a farm, the future could suddenly seem much bigger than the fields surrounding home. Still, the farmhouse remained comfortable. It held memories. It held family traditions. And for the older members of the family, leaving was difficult to imagine. They had spent most of their lives there. The house was connected to everything they knew. Every room had a memory. The kitchen reminded them of family meals. The front porch reminded them of summer evenings. The barn reminded them of years of hard work. The garden reminded them of springtime. Even the old dirt road carried memories. They had watched neighbors travel along it. They had watched children grow up on it. They had watched wagons disappear toward town. And they had watched those same wagons return at sunset. To leave meant leaving more than a building. It meant leaving a lifetime. For the younger generation, however, the idea of staying forever was harder. One of the sons eventually decided to leave. He had grown up helping on the farm. He knew how to handle horses. He knew how to work the fields. He knew how to repair fences. But he also wanted to see what existed beyond the countryside. Perhaps he had heard stories about a growing town. Perhaps he had heard that railroad companies were hiring. Perhaps he simply wanted a different life. One morning, he packed a small bag. There was not much to take. A few pieces of clothing, perhaps a pair of work boots, small personal item. Maybe a photograph of his family. He stood outside the house before leaving. The morning was quiet. The fields were still. A thin layer of mist may have rested over the grass. His family stood nearby. Nobody knew exactly how long he would be gone. He probably believed he would return. Most people who leave home do. They imagine that the road is temporary. They imagine that the future will eventually bring them back. But sometimes, life takes people farther than they expected. The young man walked toward the road. Perhaps he turned around once. Perhaps he saw the farmhouse behind him, the chimney, the porch, the barn, the trees. Everything looked familiar. Then he continued. The family went back inside. Breakfast still had to be prepared. Animals still needed to be fed. Work still needed to be done. Life continued. But the house had changed. One room was a little quieter. One chair was no longer used as often. One voice was missing from the evening conversations. These changes can be difficult to notice at first, but over time, they become part of the house. The remaining family members adjusted. They always did. The years continued. Another child grew older. Another eventually left. Then another. The family became smaller, and the world outside became larger. A letter might arrive from a distant city. The family would gather around the table to read it. The letter might describe a new job, a new apartment, new friend, a new life. The parents would be proud. But perhaps they would also feel a quiet sadness. Their children were finding their own lives. That was what children were supposed to do. Yet every departure made the farmhouse a little quieter. The old family photographs remained. The beds remained. The dishes remained. The furniture remained. But the people were changing. This was happening all across America. Rural families were beginning to experience a new kind of movement. The country was becoming increasingly connected. Railroads made travel easier. Cities offered new kinds of work. Young people who once expected to remain close to home could now travel hundreds of miles. A person could leave a small farming community and begin a completely different life somewhere else. The farmhouse could not compete with that sense of possibility. Still, not everyone wanted to leave. Some people loved the countryside. They loved the quiet mornings. They loved the open fields. They loved the changing seasons. They loved knowing their neighbors. And they loved the feeling of returning home after a long day. For the older generation, the farmhouse remained enough. They did not need a city. They did not need a factory. They did not need a busy railroad station. They had their land. They had their animals. They had their garden. They had one another. And for a while, that was enough. But the house was slowly becoming a home for fewer people. Eventually, only the older members of the family remained. The rooms that had once been filled with children became quiet. A bedroom might remain untouched for years. A wooden toy could sit inside a drawer. Small pair of shoes might remain in an attic. An old coat could hang behind a door. Nobody would throw these things away. There was no reason to. They belonged to someone. Even if that person now lived far away. This is one of the strange things about old houses. People often leave long before the objects do. A room can remain filled with memories, even when the person who created those memories is gone. The house becomes a kind of silent storage place for the past. The family continued their routine. Morning came. The fire was lit. Breakfast was prepared. The animals were fed. The fields were checked. The house was cleaned. The evening meal was prepared. Then the lamps were turned down. Came, and the cycle repeated, year after year. The older members of the family became slower. Work that once seemed easy became more difficult. The farm required strength. The barn needed repairs. The garden needed attention. There came a time when they could no longer manage everything alone. Perhaps a relative helped. Perhaps a neighbor came by. Perhaps one of their children returned for short visits. But the family was no longer as large as it had once been. and the farmhouse was beginning to feel larger. Not because the building had changed, because there were fewer voices inside it. The house had once been full of movement. Now there were long periods of silence. The ticking clock seemed louder. The wind against the windows seemed stronger. The empty rooms seemed larger. Still, there were beautiful moments. On warm summer evenings, the older couple might sit together on the porch. The sun would disappear behind the trees. The fields would turn golden. Birds would settle into the branches. The air would cool. They might talk about their children. They might remember the years when the house was full. They might laugh about something one of the children had done long ago. Then they would sit quietly. There was no need to speak all the time. The countryside provided its own music. Crickets, wind, leaves, distant animals. Perhaps far away, the faint whistle of a train. The train was a reminder that the country around them had changed. The world was moving forward. But their farmhouse remained. Eventually, one of the older family members died. The house became even quieter. Chair remained empty. A photograph was placed somewhere visible. The family gathered. There was a funeral. Neighbors came. People who had known the family for decades offered their condolences. For a short time, the farmhouse was full again. Voices filled the rooms. Doors opened and closed. People walked across the floors. Old stories were remembered. Then the visitors left. The road became quiet again. The house returned to silence. The remaining family members stayed for a while longer. But living alone in a large farmhouse was difficult. The work was too much. The house required maintenance. The land required attention. Eventually, a decision had to be made. Perhaps the remaining family member moved closer to relatives. Perhaps they went to live with one of their children. Perhaps the farm was sold. Or perhaps nobody wanted it. That possibility was becoming more common in rural America. Land that had once supported an entire family could become difficult for a single person to maintain. A younger generation might not want to continue farming. They might already have jobs elsewhere. They might have homes in growing towns. They might have families of their own. And so, one day, the farmhouse was closed. The last person walked through each room. They checked the windows. They looked at the fireplace. They walked through the kitchen. They stepped onto the porch. Perhaps they paused for a moment. Maybe they looked across the fields. They knew they were leaving something behind. The key was turned. The door closed. And for the first time in generations, there was nobody inside. The house was not yet abandoned. Someone still owned it. Someone might return. Perhaps a relative would visit in the spring. Perhaps repairs would be made. Perhaps the family would decide what to do with the property. But the farmhouse had entered a new chapter. It was no longer a living family home. It was a place waiting for someone to return, waiting for another generation, waiting for a decision. Months passed, then years. The garden became overgrown. The path became difficult to see. The barn needed repairs. Paint began to fade from the wooden walls. Leaves collected on the porch. The windows remained closed. And slowly, the farmhouse became part of the landscape. People driving along the old road still knew it was there. But fewer people stopped. Children growing up nearby heard stories about it. Some called it the old house. Others simply ignored it. The family had become scattered. Their lives continued in different towns and different states. Some had children. Those children had children. The family tree became larger. But fewer and fewer people remembered the farmhouse personally. The people who had once lived there became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The names in old family records. The house remained quiet, patient, waiting beneath the trees. And perhaps the most remarkable thing was that inside the house, the past had not completely disappeared. Old objects were still there. A photograph, a letter, a wooden chair, a family Bible, child's toy, a kitchen table. Things that had once been ordinary had now become historical clues. They were pieces of a life that had slowly vanished. Outside, the world continued changing. Cars became common. Electricity reached more rural communities. Roads improved. Telephones connected distant homes. America entered a new century. The farmhouse remained from an earlier world. And eventually, people would forget exactly when the house had become empty. That was how a home became a mystery. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because time quietly carried everyone away. The family had not disappeared in a single moment. They had simply grown older. They had moved. They had married. They had found jobs. They had built new homes. They had created new lives. And the old farmhouse had been left behind. For decades, it stood alone. Through rain, through snow, through summer heat, through autumn storms. Its roof protected the rooms as long as it could. Its wooden walls continued to hold the memories of people who had once filled the house with life. And somewhere inside, hidden beneath layers of dust and time, there were still objects waiting to be discovered. Objects that could tell us what the family had been like, what they had valued, how they lived. And perhaps, most importantly, why nobody came back. That mystery would remain inside the old farmhouse for many more years, until one day, someone finally opened the door. For many years, the farmhouse stood quietly beneath the trees. The family had moved away. The road had become quieter. The garden had disappeared beneath tall grass. And the house, once filled with voices, had become a place of silence. But the story of the farmhouse was not finished. Inside those old wooden walls, the past was still waiting. It was simply waiting for someone to notice. Years passed. Then more years. The world outside continued changing. Cars became more common. Electricity reached more communities. Telephone lines connected distant homes. Modern roads replaced many of the old dirt routes. New houses appeared in places where fields had once stretched toward the horizon. But the farmhouse remained almost untouched. It stood at the end of the old road, surrounded by trees that had grown taller and wider. The front porch had begun to lean. Some boards had faded. The windows had become cloudy with age. But the basic structure was still there. Inside, the rooms were dark. Dust covered the floors. Cobwebs stretched across corners. The air smelled of old wood and time. Yet many objects remained exactly where they had been left. An old wooden table stood in the kitchen. Chair rested beside it. Small shelf still held a few books. In one room, a photograph remained on the wall. The faces were difficult to see through the dust, but the people in the picture were still recognizable as a family. They were standing together in front of the farmhouse. Some were adults, some were children. Everyone looked serious. That was common in old photographs. A photograph was not an everyday activity. It required preparation. People dressed carefully. They stood still, and for a few moments they preserved themselves in time. The family probably had no idea that their photograph would survive longer than almost everything else they owned. They could not have imagined someone looking at it many decades later and wondering who they were. But that is exactly what happened. One day, long after the family had disappeared from the neighborhood, someone found the photograph. The farmhouse had changed ownership several times. Or perhaps ownership had become uncertain. The property had been largely ignored. But eventually, a person became interested in the old building. Maybe they were looking for historic homes. Maybe they had heard stories from local residents. Maybe they simply wanted to know what was inside. The old front door was difficult to open. The wood had swollen over the years. The hinges were rusty. But with patience, the door finally moved. A quiet sound echoed through the empty hallway. For the first time in many years, sunlight entered the house. Dust floated through the air. The rooms appeared almost frozen in another century. The visitor stepped inside slowly. There was no electricity, no modern furniture, no sound, except the wind outside. The kitchen was the first room they entered. The old table was still there. A few dishes remained. A metal pot rested near the stove. A wooden cabinet stood against the wall. The objects were ordinary, but together, they revealed something important. People had actually lived here. They had cooked here. They had eaten here. They had talked here. They had raised children here. The visitor moved through the house. Each room told another part of the story. There was an old bedroom. The bed frame remained, although the mattress had long since disappeared. Small wooden box sat beneath the window. Inside were a few personal items. A button, a piece of ribbon, an old pocket-sized notebook, handwritten name. Nothing appeared valuable. But history does not always hide inside expensive objects. Sometimes the most valuable things are ordinary. Handwritten recipe can tell us what a family ate. A school book can tell us what children studied. A letter can tell us what people worried about. A photograph can show us how they dressed. A simple household object can reveal how they lived. The visitor continued upstairs. The attic was darker. Dust covered almost everything. There were old trunks, pieces of furniture, boxes, a few pieces of clothing, perhaps a child's toy. The attic was the kind of place where families had stored things they did not need every day, but could not bring themselves to throw away. Old belongings often ended up in attics. Dress from a wedding, a coat from another winter, a broken clock, old newspapers, letters, family photographs, objects belonging to people who had died years earlier. When the visitor opened one of the trunks, they discovered more photographs. The people in the pictures were the same family, but the photographs showed different moments. Children had grown older. The family had changed. Some people appeared in one photograph, but not another. Names were written on the backs. dates were written in faded ink. Suddenly, the farmhouse had a timeline. It was possible to see the family growing across the years. A young couple became parents. Their children became teenagers. Those teenagers became adults. The family became grandparents. Then, slowly, people disappeared from the photographs. One person was no longer there. Then another. The visitor began to understand something. The house had not been abandoned because of a single tragedy. It had simply followed the ordinary pattern of human life. People were born. People grew older. People left. People died. And eventually there were not enough people remaining to keep the house alive. That realization made the farmhouse feel different. It was not a haunted place. It was a forgotten home. And there is something deeply moving about the difference. A haunted house belongs to stories. A forgotten house belongs to real people. The people who lived here had probably never imagined that their home would become interesting to strangers. They had simply lived. They had worried about harvests. They had repaired fences. They had raised children. They had written letters. They had celebrated birthdays. They had sat on the porch during summer evenings. They had watched snow fall in winter. They had experienced the ordinary joys and difficulties of life. And then, eventually, their lives ended. The house remained. The visitor found another object in the kitchen. A small, handwritten recipe. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting was faded. Perhaps it was a recipe for bread. Perhaps it was for a family dish. The exact ingredients were less important than the fact that someone had written them down. Someone had once stood in that kitchen and thought about making food for the people they loved. That simple piece of paper had survived. Another discovery came from the bedroom. A letter. The envelope was old. The handwriting was careful. It had been sent from someone who lived far away. The letter described ordinary things. Work, family, the weather, a journey. Perhaps someone was asking about the health of an elderly parent. There was nothing famous about the letter. No major historical event was mentioned. Yet the letter offered something that history books often cannot provide: human voice. For a moment, it allowed the visitor to hear the past, not through the words of presidents or generals, but through the words of an ordinary American family, the kind of people whose lives made up most of the country. The farmhouse became a small window into that world, a world without smartphones, without modern highways, without instant communication, a world where a letter could take days or weeks to arrive, a world where a trip to another town required planning, a world where families depended heavily on one another, and a world where home was often the center of everything. The visitor walked back toward the front porch. From there, the countryside looked different. The trees were larger now. The road was barely visible. The fields had changed. Some had become forest. Others had become new properties. But the basic landscape remained. The same hills were still there. The same creek still flowed nearby. The same sky stretched above the farmhouse. Nature had continued, even while the people disappeared. That may be the most remarkable part of old places. Human life feels enormous while we are living it. But nature moves at a different pace. Trees grow slowly. Rivers continue flowing. Fields change. Seasons repeat. 100 years can pass, and the landscape may still recognize itself. The farmhouse had witnessed those changes. It had survived storms. It had survived winters. It had survived years of neglect. But the people who built it were gone. Their children were gone. Their grandchildren were growing old. Their names were becoming harder to remember. The visitor began searching for information about the family. Old records could sometimes provide answers. Property documents, census records, church records, newspaper notices, birth certificates, marriage records, death records. Each document added another small piece to the story. A name, date, an occupation, a family connection, a place of birth, a place of death. Slowly, the people in the photographs became real again. The farmer had a name. His wife had a name. Their children had names. The people who had seemed like strangers in an old photograph were no longer strangers. They were a family. They had lived in this house. They had walked through these rooms. They had looked through these windows. They had stood on this porch. They had watched the same sunset. And they had once believed that the house would always belong to their family. But history rarely works that way. Buildings survive. Families move. Land changes ownership. Names disappear. And sometimes a house simply waits. The visitor eventually closed the old front door. The house became dark again. But it was no longer completely forgotten. Someone knew its story. Someone had seen the photographs. Someone had read the letters. Someone had touched the old table. Someone had stood in the same room where a family had gathered many decades earlier. And perhaps that is enough. Because history does not always require monuments. Sometimes remembering one ordinary family is enough. The farmhouse may never become famous. It may never appear in a major museum. Thousands of people may never know it existed. But its story represents something much larger. Across America, countless homes once looked like this. They were built by families who wanted a place to live. They were filled with children, meals, work, laughter, arguments, celebrations, and quiet evenings. Eventually, those families changed. Some houses were torn down, some burned, some were replaced. Some were converted into modern buildings. And some, like this farmhouse, simply remained. They became quiet witnesses to the passage of time. If you stand inside an old house long enough, you may begin to imagine the people who once lived there. You can almost hear footsteps on the stairs, a door opening, someone calling from the kitchen, child laughing outside, chair moving across the floor, the sound of rain against the windows, a quiet crackle of a fire. These sounds are gone, but the house remembers them in another way, through its worn floorboards, its faded walls, its old photographs, its marks and scratches, its objects, its architecture. The past is not completely gone. It is simply quieter. And perhaps that is why forgotten houses can feel so peaceful. They remind us that every life, no matter how ordinary, leaves something behind. A name, photograph, a letter, a recipe, chair, a house, a memory. The family that once lived in this farmhouse believed they were simply living their lives. They could not know that more than a century later, someone would stand inside the same house and wonder about them. They could not know that their ordinary routines would become part of a story. And they certainly could not know that the house they called home would one day remain standing after almost everyone who knew it was gone. The farmhouse had been quiet for a long time, but now its silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of being forgotten. It was the silence of being remembered. Outside, evening was approaching. The sunlight moved through the trees. Dust floated gently through the last golden light. The old road disappeared into the distance. The house stood beneath the branches, just as it had for generations. And somewhere inside, the past remained. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, waiting. The house had spent nearly a century empty, but for the first time in many years, someone had opened the door. And sometimes, that is all history needs. Someone willing to look inside, someone willing to listen, and someone willing to remember the ordinary people who came before us. Because behind every forgotten house, there may be a story. And behind every story, there was once a life.